We live in a completely unique time in world history where the gap between the very rich and the very poor has never been wider. As we've read in the news in recent weeks, Elon Musk is offering to pay somewhere close to $41 billion for Twitter. He is a man who has more wealth than the GDP of most countries in the world. That's very hard to get your head around, that so much money is held by one person. And it raises the question of what's enough? Here's one way to look at it, is that if a person who had just $1 billion, okay, and they spent $10,000 a day, it would take them 275 years to spend it down. In a provocative tweet, the Christian author Brian Zand recently asked, "I don't know, but it seems like once you have $1 billion, you should be told, you won the game, congratulations, and from now on, you'll be taxed at 100%. I'm sure I overlooked something, and no doubt someone on Twitter will spring to the defense of billionaires." After hundreds of tweets in favor of the billionaires, he replied, "Man, who knew these poor besieged billionaires have so many ready to spring to their defense?" And then in another provocative tweet, he wrote, there are 2,688 billionaires in the world. Collectively, they are worth $12.7 trillion. Meanwhile, 3 billion people live on $5 a day. In a sentence, how would an alien visitor to our planet describe this? Follow-up, do you think the God of the Bible has an opinion on this? And of course, there were lots of responses to his provocative text, but I thought they were really interesting, and it kind of sets the stage for what I want to talk about today, because I think it's on a lot of people's mind. I'm not so interested today in giving you a Christian tax policy or a public policy or an economic policy. What I really want to talk about today is how much is enough money, and what is the role of money for a person who takes seriously the call to follow the teachings of Jesus. And Jesus, unlike many topics that he's attributed to speaking a lot about, he does speak a lot about money. Some scholars have suggested that 40% of Jesus' parables have to do with money. Here are a few highlights from the teachings of Jesus on finances. Well, in today's reading, Jesus famously says it would be harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel to get through the eye of a needle. Some scholars have suggested that the eye of the needle means the gate of the city, where you would take your things off the camel to get in. But most scholars believe Jesus is using a very common phrase of his time for describing things that are very difficult. In fact, in Persian culture, there's a similar phrase, something to the effect that if something is really challenging, it's as hard as getting an elephant through the eye of a needle. So this was sort of a common phrase about things that are difficult. But either way, I think you'll agree, Jesus is making a clear point that having lots of money can be a challenge to a healthy spiritual growth. In another story with a rich man and a beggar named Lazarus, the beggar is at the gate asking the rich man for funds. They're both in heaven and hell. The rich man is in hell. Lazarus is in heaven, the beggar. And the rich man asks God, please go warn my brothers and of their materialism, change their ways. And God concludes, no, it won't help. I've already sent teachers. They've ignored it. And so there's no hope for them. So that's a pretty dire passage. In another passage known as the rich young man, a rich man who follows the religious laws of his day, who's wealthy, comes to Jesus boasting that he obeys all the religious laws in every detail. And he asks, okay, so, what can I do? And Jesus famously says, you lack one thing. Sell everything that you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me. And it concludes with the rich young man walking away sad, demonstrating that money can be a hindrance to spiritual growth. In another passage, Jesus tells a parable that I think very relevant to America today. In the United States today, one of the most growing businesses we have is storage. People are constantly buying more and more storage units. Storage units are constantly being built. In this parable, Jesus tells about a rich man who makes so much money from his crops that all he can do is build bigger and bigger barns to store the crops that he has in extra in abundance. And the story ends with this: God saying, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And this is how it will be with those who store up things for themselves, but it's not on earth, but are not rich toward God." So from these texts, I think it's clear that Jesus is making a very clear point that we cannot be a servant to two masters. We cannot worship both God and money. We have to choose, and we have to navigate it in this world as we develop our spiritual life. Now, some would suggest, and some religions have suggested, that it's the only path to heaven is to give up your money altogether. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with certain religions that have vows of poverty. You need to give it all up. And I don't believe Jesus is saying that we need to give up all of our money. But the challenge for ministers, particularly, to speak about this topic with their members has always been a very tough one. And one of the reasons is because, guess what? Ministers are paid by their congregations. And very often, they're paid by the wealthy members of the congregation. And so, historically, ministers have been shy about talking about money and the importance of priorities in terms of money for fear of making people pissed off and deciding, I'm not going to give to the minister anymore. So ministers are often in a tough shop. And in fact, many of the most successful churches in our country today preach what's known as the prosperity gospel, that if you follow Jesus, you will receive wealth. I don't think those teachings have any justification in Scripture, but I do know that most of the members of those churches in many cases become poor and the pastors become much richer. But through history, there have been great spiritual teachers who have been willing to talk about what is enough and how money can fit into our life. And I've seen this in my own life. You've heard me talk about my own mentor, the Reverend Peter Gomes, the famous preacher at Harvard's chapel. And he had firm views on it. And here he was at Harvard's chapel, which is obviously a very wealthy crowd that he's preaching to each week. And he never shied away from talking about the fact that if you have money, it's an obligation to be stewards with it and to use it for the betterment of others. One time he and I were invited to a conference where he was giving the keynote in a place called Laity Lodge in Texas. And it was a meeting of corporate leaders. And Peter, never afraid to speak his mind, preached about the parable that I mentioned earlier of the rich young man. And he ended his message saying something to the effect to this very wealthy audience: so you must give an answer to the question, are you ready to give up your money and seek to follow Jesus? Well, the host of the event was livid. He was the heir to the H-E-B supermarkets. And he went up in front of Peter and stood and said, "This is communism. We don't need someone from Harvard to come down to Texas to tell us what to do with our money. God wants us to be wealthy so we can serve God. You are an embarrassment." And we were banished from next day's meeting. So Peter and I sat in inner tubes floating in the lake, reveling in the controversy, and we would for years. So Peter Gomes wasn't alone in speaking truth about wealth. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist religion, was banned from preaching in churches. He was an Anglican priest, and he took to the fields to preach to the common person. And he came up with some very relevant guidelines for people in that time period of what they could do with money, and basically stressed that we're trustees of God's money that we have. He encouraged his followers to avoid debt and to keep up with their regular expenses and give the rest away and help others in need. Another great leader was brought to my attention, someone I'm aware of, but Steve was reading the newsletter this week and said he probably couldn't join but hoped that I would mention the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer's thoughts on wealth in his book, Costs of Discipleship. He wrote, "Earthly goods are given to be used, not to be collected. In the wilderness, God gave Israel the manna every day, and they had no need to worry about food and drink. Indeed, if they kept any of the manna over until the next day, it went bad. In the same way, the disciple must receive his portion from God every day. If he stores it up as a permanent possession, he spoils not only the gift, but himself as well. He sets his heart on the accumulated wealth and makes it a barrier between himself and God. Where our treasure is, there is our trust, our security, our consolation, and our God. Hoarding is idolatry." Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said something similar a couple decades later. "Money in its proper place is a worthwhile and necessary instrument for a well-rounded life. But when it is projected to the status of a god, it becomes a power that corrupts and an instrument of exploitation." Swedenborg, in today's passage that we read, responds to a common view that was being debated, that the rich cannot get into heaven based on reading of text. He makes a case that it's not about being rich, it's not about being poor, it is about your motivation. And if you're rich, your use of funds. Money is neither good nor bad, it's an energy, but it's how you use it, for the common good or for selfish reasons. In another report from Swedenborg, he talks about people in hell who are forever counting what they believe is money. They're perpetually obsessed with it. They never got enough, and their souls were corrupted by it. Now, one thing to keep in mind about each of these spiritual teachers, for the most part, they were all well-funded. They were funded. So it wasn't like they were saying there's no need for funds. Jesus had to buy food and supplies, and he lived with his disciples. And something that is rarely ever reported, who financed Jesus? It's quite amazing. It's primarily women. In the Bible, in Luke chapter 8, we're told that Mary Magdalene, Jonah, the wife of Herod's steward Chusa, and Susanna, and many others provided for the resources. So that's fairly fascinating that Jesus was primarily funded by women who gave money. And it's interesting, we don't think of women having money at that time, but they did. Jesus needed money for his ministry. Wesley was raised in poverty, but he became, in his day, really one of the most wealthy men in all of England. Swedenborg himself came from his mother's side from a wealthy family, and a noble family, and he traveled around Europe as a young man, and you read these letters, and he's always asking for more money. His ability to follow his commission and write and publish at no charge was based on the fact that his expenses were covered. Now, he lived a very simple lifestyle, but it is important that he had his needs taken care of, and that is another example. Bonhoeffer, too, grew up in a prominent, wealthy family, and when he was, you read his letters to his parents when he's younger, I need more money, as he's traveling around Europe, very similar to Swedenborg. And then Peter Gomes, I don't know that he ever became a super wealthy man, but he grew up in a lower income family, but he did achieve financial success through various books. So the desire to say that having money is terrible and it's horrible and people shouldn't have money is not the point. It's really how it is used. And it also absolutely does require knowing when enough is enough. As I read these, the wisdom of these teachers, I see three core messages, if I would distill it, that are, I think, helpful for us today. First, when it comes to money and obtaining money, check your motivation. Money is an energy source for good or for evil. In the right hands, money can do good, but it very often corrupts. The question for a follower of Jesus should be asking, whatever money I have, is it being used to the glory of God? Second, having lots of money makes spiritual growth challenging. And here's why. If you have a lot of money, you're going to have a very hard time getting any honest feedback on your life. Once you have lots of money, people will treat you better, respect you more, seek you out, tell you what you want to hear. Very often, the more money you have, the less likely you'll know when you can get honest feedback. One person I met recently, a philanthropist who just became wealthy, said, suddenly, I'm told how great I look, how brilliant I am, how cool my glasses look. So there is a certain danger, a corruption around large amounts of money, and it can lead us to also be a little bit more narcissistic and arrogant in dealing with others because we can pay for things. We don't have to deal with the mundane. So that's another challenge. We often see celebrities who make a lot of money. What happens? They make the money and then they crash and burn. And I think very often that money also has a danger in that it allows us to pursue our darker sides. The third point I'd say is that what these teachers all seem to be saying is if you have extra money after you've taken care of yourself and planned, give it away. There are plenty of people just surviving. So if you have extra, give it to them. A small amount from you can make a big difference in the life of someone in need. Now, the challenge for people of wealth to give away surplus money is real. I saw this a few years back. I was invited to a conference of next generation wealth leaders, and the topic was spirituality and money. And I made my case, much like I'm making today, that, when you have enough, you should give it away. And one young person with a very famous last name challenged me for not being specific enough. And he said, "You are coddling us. We have a climate change crisis that will destroy the earth in 2 decades. And then almost yelling, he said, "You're a strategist. Tell us what we should do. Give us a plan." In his own way, he was asking, how much is enough? So I took him at his word, and I came up with a plan on the spot. I suggested he figure out how long he was likely to live. Then I asked him to multiply that number by 200,000. And I said that would give you ample funds for the rest of your life, so put that aside. Then I suggested he take the rest of it and give it or invest in climate change organizations on the front line of the battle. I said, get experts to help you give it away, but give it away. Now, don't wait. Well, he looked down and said, that's not what I mean. I'm not looking for anything that drastic. And he walked away very sad. Another very wealthy funder asked my advice on various nonprofits and social ventures in the area of his interest. When it came time to write the checks, he balked, saying, they don't have the ability to handle the money. So I responded, then you can fund the infrastructure around them to allow them to use the funds properly. You could pay for that too. But he too walked away. So having enough money and knowing what to do with it is a challenge. It is a challenge. But enough money isn't just a challenge for the rich. And I would be remiss in this sermon by not talking about the fact that many of us will not have to wrestle with that problem. Money also places a challenge on the vast majority of us who don't feel we have enough. And we can easily get caught up into envy, jealousy, and even hatred of those who have more. When we see the super wealthy crash, we feel a sense of pleasure at their disaster. This is also a spiritual challenge for each of us. So when it comes to money, all of us benefit from looking at what we have and asking ourselves, how much do I really need? How much is enough? What can I do with it? I think from the scriptures and our great teachers that we've reviewed today, we get an answer that once we had enough to live daily and plan responsibly, we should use the surplus and be generous as stewards to what we are given and support others. And that should be enough. Amen.